I was 6,000 miles away, in a shipping container converted into a field office outside a logistics hub in the Gulf, when my neighbor finally reached me on a satellite line that dropped twice before the call went through clean enough for me to understand what she was telling me. Marlene Ostrowski's voice was shaking, and I remember thinking, in the first few seconds before the words actually landed, that something had happened to one of her own kids, because that was the only kind of news I could imagine producing that particular tremor in a 68-year-old woman I'd known for 11 years and had never once heard raise her voice. "Cal," she said, "they tore it down. Your house. The HOA sent a crew out Tuesday. It's gone, Cal. There's nothing left but the slab." I stood in that shipping container for a long moment, phone pressed hard enough against my ear that it hurt, listening to satellite static fill the silence after she finished. And I remember thinking, with the specific flat clarity that comes right before a person's mind actually catches up to what it's just been told, that I needed to get home, and that whatever had happened, I was going to need to understand every single detail of exactly how the Homeowners Association manages to demolish a fully paid off, fully insured, occupied residential property while its owner is overseas on a government contract. Because in 22 years of exactly this kind of work, I had learned that institutions rarely make a mistake that large by accident. They make it because somewhere, at some point, somebody decided the rules were an inconvenience rather than a requirement. 14 months later, a jury returned a verdict of $12,100,000 against Ridgeline Commons Homeowners Association, and the judge who read it aloud took the additional step, rare enough that even Priya Anand, the attorney who'd carried the case from the very first week, told me she'd only seen it happen twice in her entire career, of stating from the bench, on the record, that the association's conduct represented as clear a due process violation as this court has encountered. Before I explain exactly how that happened, you should understand who I am and why the absence that made my house an apparent target was never the accident Ridgeline Commons Board wanted everyone to believe it was. My name is Cal Weller, 55 years old, 22 years in the Army before I retired as a logistics officer, followed by 9 more years doing overseas contract logistics work for the Defense Department, the kind of career that has you gone for 6, 8, sometimes 10 months at a stretch, home just long enough between rotations to mow the lawn, fix whatever needed fixing, and remember what it felt like to sleep in my own bed before the next contract sent me somewhere else entirely. I never married, never had kids, the specific consequence of a career that made both considerably harder to sustain than most people outside it probably imagine, and the house became, over 14 years, closer to family than most things in my life. The one place that stayed exactly itself no matter how many months I spent somewhere else entirely. I bought my house in Ridgeline Commons 14 years ago, a modest 3-bedroom on a quiet cul-de-sac, paid it off outright 6 years later with a combination of deployment pay and the specific, patient frugality that a career spent living out of a duffel bag tends to produce in a person, and I'd always considered it, across every long rotation overseas, the one fixed point I was working toward getting back to. I'd build a workshop in the garage over successive leaves, a woodworking hobby that gave my hands something to do the months I was actually home, and I'd filled the house, slowly, deployment by deployment, with the kind of things a person accumulates when they're finally settled enough in one place to start caring what a room looks like. My father's old rocking chair, refinished myself over one long leave. A set of hand tools that had belonged to my grandfather, who'd built furniture for half the county in his own time. Boxes of photographs from every posting I'd ever had, the only physical record of an entire career spent mostly somewhere else. I'd left for this particular contract, a 6-month logistics support assignment tied to a base consolidation project, 4.5 months before Marlene's call reached me. And I want to be precise about something here, because it mattered enormously to everything that followed. I did not leave my house unmaintained, unmonitored, or in any condition that could reasonably be described as abandoned. I had a lawn service under contract, paid a year in advance, cutting the grass every 10 days. I had Marlene, 2 doors down, checking the mail and the porch twice a week, the same arrangement we'd had for 6 straight deployments before this one, ever since her own husband passed, and she told me, half joking, that keeping an eye on my place gave her a reason to walk the block she wouldn't otherwise have bothered making. I had my homeowner's insurance current, my property taxes current, and I had critically formally notified the HOA's own management office in writing, the same way I had before every prior deployment, of my extended absence, my emergency contact information, and a forwarding address for any correspondence 3 weeks before I left the country. Ridgeline Commons is a development of 230 homes, built out in phases through the 2000s, and had, for most of the 14 years I'd lived there, been managed by a board that ran things with the kind of low-key competence that makes a homeowners association almost invisible in a resident's daily life, exactly the way I've always believed one ought to function. That changed roughly 18 months before my house was demolished, when a woman named Pamela Voss became board president campaigning, according to residents I spoke with once I was finally home long enough to piece together the full timeline, on a platform of what she called addressing long-neglected blight issues that she felt the prior board had let slide for years. Pamela had, in her 18 months in office, pushed through an aggressive expansion of the association's code enforcement authority, including a newly adopted abandoned and blighted property ordinance granting the board emergency authority to order demolition of any structure meeting a specific set of criteria. Unmaintained landscaping, accumulated mail or newspapers, extended periods of apparent vacancy, without the standard extended notice and hearing process the association's own prior governing documents had required for any action of that scale. The ordinance had passed, according to board minutes I'd eventually obtain, on a vote of 4-1, with a lone dissenting member, a man named Trent Aldworth, noting in the record his concern that the emergency authority provision creates unacceptable risk of the board acting on incomplete information without meaningful opportunity for a homeowner to respond. Trent turned out to be entirely correct in a way that would matter a great deal more than anyone on that board could have anticipated the day they voted. What actually happened, once I finally had the full picture assembled through PRIA's formal records request and the discovery process that followed, was this: 3 months into my deployment, a resident complaint, filed anonymously through the HOA's online portal, flagged my house as appearing vacant with accumulated exterior clutter, a description that, as it turned out, referred to a stack of firewood I kept along the side fence, seasoned and covered under a tarp exactly the way it had sat for the previous 6 years without a single prior complaint. Pamela's board, rather than sending the standard courtesy notice the association's own bylaws required for any initial landscaping or maintenance concern, classified the complaint under the new emergency blight ordinance, authorized an inspection, and, finding the lawns slightly overgrown between service visits, a matter of maybe 4 unmowed days given my contractor's 10-day cycle, and the woodpile the anonymous complaint had flagged, declared the property formally blighted under the ordinance's criteria. The ordinance required, even under its expedited emergency provisions, formal written notice to the property owner via certified mail, along with a 14-day posting of the property itself before any demolition authorization could proceed. The HOA's management office had my current mailing information on file, the same forwarding address I provided in writing 3 weeks before departure, current, verified, and specifically intended for exactly this kind of correspondence. The certified notice the board's records show being generated was addressed instead to a post office box I had closed 4 years earlier, an old address still sitting, uncorrected, in an outdated field of the association's property management software that nobody had apparently bothered to reconcile against my more recent, formally submitted update. I want to be precise about why that distinction mattered so enormously to the eventual case. An honest clerical error, a genuinely overlooked database field, might have been forgivable if isolated. What discovery ultimately revealed was that Pamela had, in fact, been informed directly by the association's own office manager, in an email exchange entered into evidence during litigation, that a more current forwarding address existed in my file, and had responded, in her own words, "Let's proceed with what we have on record for the certified mail requirement. We're on a timeline for the amenity committee's spring proposal, and I don't want this hanging over the next board cycle." The amenity committee's spring proposal, as it turned out, was a plan to convert 3 underutilized lots at the edge of the development, including, once my house was gone, the lot my home had occupied, into an expanded clubhouse annex and pickleball complex, a project Pamela had championed since before her election and had, according to the same email chain, been quietly hoping to accelerate by identifying properties that could be acquired or repurposed with minimal resistance. The demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday morning while Marlene was at a doctor's appointment 2 towns over. The one morning in 11 years of watching my house during deployments that her usual routine happened to shift. By the time she got home that afternoon and saw the empty slab where my house had stood that morning, there was nothing left to stop, nothing left to document beyond the aftermath, and the crew, working under an HOA-issued authorization that, on its face, appeared entirely in order to a contractor with no reason to question the paperwork in front of him, had already loaded out and left. I flew home 11 days after Marlene's call, the fastest rotation my contract allowed, changing flights twice, the whole 18-hour journey spent turning over the same handful of facts I had, unable to reach anyone who could tell me anything more useful than what Marlene had already relayed. She picked me up from the airport herself, insisted on it despite my telling her a cab would be fine, and drove me straight to the house without either of us saying much of anything on the way, the particular kind of silence 2 people share when there's nothing worth saying until you've actually seen the thing you're driving toward. I stood on the same slab my house had sat on for 14 years, looking at a flat rectangle of exposed foundation and disturbed earth where every physical object I owned outside of what fit in 2 duffel bags had, until 11 days earlier, existed. My father's rocking chair, my grandfather's tools, 14 years of photographs from a career spent mostly somewhere else, the only continuous record I'd ever kept of any of it. Marlene stood beside me for a long while, not saying anything either, and I remember noticing, in the specific detached way a person notices small things while their mind is still catching up to something much larger, that somebody had at least coiled the garden hose neatly against what remained of the foundation wall, an oddly considerate detail in the middle of everything else that had clearly been handled with no consideration at all. "I'm sorry, Cal," Marlene finally said. "I keep going over that morning in my head. If my appointment had been any other day, this isn't on you," I told her, and meant it entirely. "You've watched this house through 6 deployments. Nobody could have stopped a bulldozer with a work order in its hand. Pamela Voss met me at the HOA office 3 days after I landed, and I want to describe that conversation carefully because it told me almost everything I needed to know about how the rest of this was going to go. "Mr. Weller," she said, "I want you to know the board followed its established emergency blight procedures in full. We attempted certified notice, and when it wasn't claimed within the response window, the ordinance's provisions allowed us to proceed. The certified notice went to a P.O. box I closed 4 years ago," I said. "I provided current contact information to your office in writing 3 weeks before I left the country. I have the email confirmation." Something in her expression tightened, briefly. The particular recalibration of someone realizing an objection has landed somewhere more specific than she'd expected. "I'd have to review our office's records on that," she said. "But I want to be clear that the board acted in good faith based on the information available to us through our standard notification process." "Was there a 14-day posting at the property?" I asked, the way the ordinance requires before demolition could be authorized. "I believe our contractor handled the posting requirement," she said, in a tone that told me, 22 years of exactly this kind of institutional evasiveness having taught me to recognize it instantly, that she genuinely did not know the answer and was hoping I wouldn't ask a follow-up. "Mrs. Voss," I said, "I was serving overseas on a government logistics contract. I gave your office written notice of that, along with current contact information, specifically so a situation like this couldn't happen. I'd like to understand, plainly, how a fully paid, fully insured, actively maintained home ended up demolished while I trusted that notice to actually mean something. I understand this has been an extremely difficult situation for you," she said, the particular practice sympathy of someone reciting a line rather than actually engaging with the question, "and the board is prepared to discuss what reasonable accommodation might look like going forward." "I don't want an accommodation," I said. "I want to understand exactly what happened, and I want it in writing." She did not offer that day or at any point in the weeks that followed. I did not raise my voice. I did not, that day, tell her anything about what I intended to do next. I thanked her for her time, and I called Priya Anand that same afternoon, an attorney whose name I'd gotten from a fellow contractor 2 rotations earlier who needed similar help with a property dispute during his own deployment, and told her everything. "Cal," she said once I'd finished, "I need every piece of documentation you have. Your notification email to the HOA, your insurance records, your lawn service contract, everything." Establishing the property was actively maintained and monitored. This is not, on its face, a simple property dispute. If what you're describing holds up under discovery, this is a fundamental due process failure by an entity that demolished a citizen's home while he was serving his country overseas, using a notice process it appears to have known was defective. What followed over the next several weeks turned what could have been a straightforward, if devastating, property claim into something considerably larger. The county's own building department, once Priya formally notified them of the demolition, opened an independent inquiry, given that any demolition, even one authorized under an HOA's internal ordinance, still required a county permit that had, as it turned out, never actually been pulled. The contractor apparently operating under the reasonable but mistaken assumption that the HOA's own paperwork constituted sufficient authorization on its own. That single missing permit, once flagged, opened an entirely separate line of municipal liability that ran alongside the civil case Priya was building and prompted the county to issue its own formal violation notice against both the HOA and the demolition contractor. Trent Aldworth, the lone board member who'd voted against the emergency blight ordinance 18 months earlier, called me directly once word of the demolition and the mounting scrutiny reached him. Deeply shaken, he told me, by watching the exact scenario he'd warned about actually happen to a specific neighbor rather than remaining an abstract concern in a meeting minute nobody had taken seriously enough at the time. I kept my own notes from that board meeting, he told me, sitting across from me at a diner near the development, sliding a folder across the table the way I imagine evidence changes hands in exactly this kind of story more often than anyone would probably guess. And I went back through every email I still had access to once I heard what happened to your house. Pamela knew about the address discrepancy. I have the email where our office manager flagged it directly to her, for days before the certified notice went out to the old P.O. box anyway. And there's more. He tapped the folder. The amenity committee's site plan for the pickleball expansion, dated 6 weeks before the demolition, already shows your lot incorporated into the footprint. She wasn't waiting to see what happened with your property. She'd already decided what she wanted to happen to it. I handed that folder to Priya the same afternoon. What emerged over the following months? Once formal discovery compelled production of the association's complete internal communications, was a considerably more complete and damning picture than even Trent's folder alone had suggested. The office manager's email specifically flagging my correct forwarding address, for days before the certified notice went out regardless. Pamela's own reply prioritizing the amenity committee's timeline over resolving the discrepancy. The site plan, dated weeks before my house, was even formally classified as blighted, already incorporating the lot my home occupied into the pickleball complex's footprint. And, perhaps most damaging of all once entered into evidence, text messages between Pamela and the demolition contractor, a company called Redline Demolition Services whose owner, it turned out, was married to Pamela's own sister, a connection nobody on the board had ever disclosed, arranging an expedited timeline specifically in Pamela's own words. Before the owner's rotation ends and he's back stateside asking questions we don't want to be answering. She had known, in writing, that I was overseas, that my rotation had an end date, and had specifically timed the demolition to occur before I returned. The trial, roughly 14 months after my house was demolished, unfolded before a jury that Priya later told me she'd rarely seen grow visibly more attentive with each successive piece of evidence entered against the defense. The gallery filled steadily over the course of the week, Marlene attending every single day, seated near the front with the same quiet, steady presence she'd brought to watching my house through 6 deployments, and Trent Aldworth beside her most afternoons once his own testimony had concluded. Priya walked the jury through the notification failure. The office manager's flag warning Pamela had overridden the pre-existing site plan, and the undisclosed family relationship with the contractor Pamela had specifically instructed to move before my return. She called the county building official first, establishing plainly that no demolition permit had ever been issued for the property, a fact that alone, she told the jury, should have stopped every truck on that job site before a single blade of grass was disturbed. She called Trent, who described the board meeting where the emergency ordinance passed, and his own recorded objection, his voice steady even as he acknowledged, under cross-examination, that he'd voted against the measure but had not at the time imagined it would be used this way this quickly. And she called Pamela's own office manager, a soft-spoken woman named Denise Okafor, who had, by then, left her position at the HOA entirely, testifying with evident discomfort that she had personally flagged the address discrepancy to Pamela in writing 4 days before the certified notice went out to the closed P.O. box regardless. I told her the forwarding address was more recent, Denise testified. She told me to proceed with what we had on file. I didn't feel it was my place to push back further than I already had. Priya closed with a line I heard repeated by 3 separate jurors afterward when they spoke with reporters outside the courthouse. This wasn't a mistake made under a defective process. This was a defective process, kept defective on purpose, because the person running it had already decided what she wanted the outcome to be. Pamela's attorney attempted to argue that the board had acted within the letter of its own emergency ordinance, a defense that collapsed almost entirely once Priya walked the jury through the specific text of that ordinance's own notice requirements, still unmet by any reasonable reading regardless of Pamela's interpretation. And once the county's own building official testified that no demolition permit had ever been issued for the property at all, meaning the demolition itself had been not only procedurally defective under the HOA's own rules, but flatly illegal under municipal code from the very first swing of the excavator. Judge Adelaide Ferris, presiding over the case, asked Pamela's attorney a single question during his closing argument that Priya told me afterward she considered the moment the defense's last realistic hope of a favorable outcome effectively ended. Counsel, your client's own office manager flagged the correct forwarding address in writing before the certified notice was sent. Your client's own text messages show her specifically timing the demolition to occur before the property owner's return from overseas service, and no county demolition permit was ever obtained. At what point in that sequence does this remain a good faith procedural misstep, rather than a knowing effort to complete an unauthorized demolition before anyone could object to it? He offered something about the board relying on its contractor's representations regarding permitting, and Judge Ferris let him finish before responding with the particular quiet finality Priya had told me to watch for in a courtroom. Counsel, a board that authorizes demolition of an occupied residence bears responsibility for confirming its own authorization as lawful. I don't find that argument persuasive, and I suspect the jury won't either. There was no good answer beyond that, because there wasn't one to give. The jury's verdict, once deliberations concluded, reflected the full scale of what the evidence had shown. Compensatory damages, covering the home's full replacement value, the loss of its contents, and the cost of temporary housing throughout the litigation, came to just over $4 million. Punitive damages, addressing what the jury's own written finding described as a knowing and deliberate circumvention of required due process, timed specifically to prevent the property owner's ability to respond, added $8 million more, bringing the total to $12,100,000. The figure Judge Ferris read aloud in a courtroom that had, according to everyone who described it to me afterward, gone entirely silent the moment she finished. Judge Ferris was not finished with her remarks. She noted from the bench that the court consider the association's conduct as clear a due process violation as this court has encountered, and referred the matter of Pamela Voss's undisclosed financial relationship with the demolition contractor, along with the broader pattern of the emergency ordinance's misuse, to the state's Common Interest Community Oversight Office, which, several months later, issued a censure barring Pamela from any future HOA leadership role and mandating a full governance review of Ridgeline Commons' remaining emergency authority provisions. Pamela resigned within the week. Trent Aldworth was elected board president the following spring, and one of his administration's first formal actions was to repeal the emergency blight ordinance in its entirety, replacing it with a revised process requiring the full extended notice and hearing procedure the association's original governing documents had always specified. No exceptions, no board discretion to bypass it under any circumstance. A rule he told me existed for exactly the reason it now carried a specific name, attached to it in every board member's memory going forward. I rebuilt on the same slab over the following 18 months, working with a contractor Marlene recommended, a careful, patient man named HOA Bulldozed, who'd built additions for half the street over the years and understood, better than most people I interviewed for the job, exactly why I wanted the new house to feel, as closely as memory could reconstruct it, like the one that had stood there for 14 years before a board president's timeline decided it was more convenient gone. I couldn't recover my grandfather's tools or my father's rocking chair, but I found, going through storage units and old photographs, enough reference to rebuild the workshop layout almost exactly as it had been, and HOA, without my ever quite asking him to, frame the new garage with the same rough dimensions the old one had, down to the particular corner where I'd always kept my workbench angled to catch the morning light. Marlene brought a housewarming casserole the week I finally moved back in. The same dish, she told me, she'd made for every neighbor on the block at one point or another over the decades she'd lived there, and stood in my new kitchen looking around at walls that smelled faintly of fresh paint rather than the 14 years of a life that used to fill them. It's not the same house, she said, but it's starting to feel like the same street again. I still keep the office manager's original email, the one flagging my correct forwarding address 4 days before the certified notice went out anyway, printed and framed in what is now my new home office, hanging above the desk where I do most of my paperwork between rotations. Marlene asked me once, not long after I moved back in, why I bothered keeping it rather than simply putting the whole ordeal behind me. Because for 4 days, I told her somebody had the right information sitting in an inbox, and a decision already made about what she wanted to happen to my lot. And she chose the second thing over the first, while I was 6,000 miles away trusting that the address I gave in writing actually meant something. She didn't argue with that. In the 11 years she's watched my house during every deployment before or since, I don't think she ever once has. The new house stands now on the same slab, the same cul-de-sac, the same quiet street I've spent 14 years and counting, treating as the one fixed point worth coming home to. I leave again in a few months for another rotation, the same arrangement with the lawn service, the same understanding with Marlene, the same forwarding address on file with an HOA board that, for the first time in a long while, I actually trust to use it correctly if it ever needs to. Some things I've found only really become fixed points once you've watched what it costs to lose one, and rebuilt it anyway, board by board, on the same ground it always stood on.